Very good afternoon to all of those who are here, and greetings to everyone online. Thank you for joining this session of the Harvard Climate Action Week. My name is Akash Deep. I'm a faculty member here at the Kennedy School, and we are deeply grateful to Salata for giving us this opportunity. Uh, there were a lot of people who are presenting in this week of climate-related events, and we are very pleased to be part of that. I'm going to be talking today and this session is going to be in two parts. Uh, one part is going to be about research that we are doing here at the Kennedy School, primarily with the support of the Belfer Center, as well as intellectual inspiration from the other centers, including the Center for Business and Government, the Center for International Development, and of course, Salata Institute. And I'm going to talk about this broad idea of development optimal climate finance. And in the second part of this, we are going to be having a discussion with Nick O'Donoghue, who is senior fellow here at the Kennedy School for this year, and I'll introduce him a little later in the proceedings. So with that, and also thanks to those who have helped make this event happen, Liz Hanlon here, Rachel Murrell, thank you, and Kartikeya Bhadotia for your help. If I've missed somebody else, there are a lot of people who have made this event possible, so thank you. So let's get right into the discussion of what development optimal climate finance means. And as I said, the work that I'm going to be presenting covers various different projects that we have done. And so if you can have the next slide, please, there are multiple people that have worked on this project. Oh, okay. Oh, perfect. It's I have, and the work that you are going to be seeing today was done in collaboration with my colleague Henry Lee, who is also the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Policy Program here at the Belfer Center, and big supporter of this, as well as students or graduates of the Kennedy School and the Business School, Linus Beer, Ruben Figuera, and Hannah Wong. So what is this idea behind development optimal climate finance? When I started working on climate issues, one of the things that we found was that development and climate issues are deeply intertwined, particularly when we talk about development in the context of emerging markets and developing economies, which are some of the most significant players and actors in the climate space as well. And when we saw them as intertwined, we also noticed, however, that they have different impacts. So if you think about the benefits, costs, and risks of development, they are distinct from the benefits, costs, and risks of climate. And for the time being, I'm going to talk about sort of the broad notion of climate, primarily in the sense of mitigation. Later on, we will go a little bit deeper and talk about particularly adaptation and mitigation separately. But at a broad level, the benefits of development are localized, whereas the benefits of climate are much more global. It's to generate global public goods. The cost at which we try to meet development goals is what we are calling development optimal solution. Development resources are scarce, they are expensive. We want them to get the maximum bang for the development buck. Right? And the cost of climate-based solutions often can be higher, right? Places where the two merge, that's wonderful if the development optimal solution is also the climate optimal solution. But oftentimes they are not. There's a higher cost that's involved with the optimal climate solution. And finally, the risks of development that are related to economic growth, political stability, regulation, currency, what have you, those are quite different from the risks of clean energy and climate agreements and the price of carbon, etc. The problem is that finance often bundles them together. And that leads to blurred priorities, suboptimal solutions, misallocation of resources. And there are a variety of reasons why that has happened in different institutions and why that's the case. But we believe the main thesis of what we are doing here is to making the argument that to be effective And to be fair, financing must reflect these differences. Right? And so the goal of this concept of development optimal climate finance is to disentangle climate benefits, costs, and risks from those of development and use that as a way to mobilize resources, to source it from different places. The place where climate finance comes from is different from where development finance comes from. And to be able to make that distinction. So that is broadly what development optimal climate finance is. It is trying to think about what are the development goals, let's optimize that, and let's think about climate finance. That's not to say that we are saying let's forget about the climate and do development. But the goal is to say, let's think about what is development optimal, and then let's think about the incremental benefits, costs, and risks that need to be in place to be able to get the right climate solution. Right? And as I said, this idea of development optimal climate finance is not something that we started with. We started with more simple problems, well, not easy problems, but simple problems. One of them was, how do we mobilize more capital for the energy transition, for the green transition in emerging markets? And I will talk a little bit about a concept that we came up with called the green swap. Related to that is also a new idea about carbon credits that we are calling development optimal carbon credits. And this is work that is going to, we have made some significant progress in this work, and in about 4 to 6 weeks, we'll have another event to talk about those findings and the calibration of those models. We can also apply these ideas. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about them, but how do we spend the $300 billion new collective quantified goal that was agreed upon at the last COP? Similar ideas can be applied. How do we think about a better assessment of what the climate needs are and development needs are, thinking about them separately? And finally, today I will talk about the scope and horizon of aid, which will lead us into the conversation later on, right? So let's get right into, and I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about each of these. The goal, again, is not to linger on the solution itself, but to think about the concept of development optimal climate finance that underlies these. And so what is the notion of the green swap and development optimal financing, right? So think about a project. Let's say this is India, and India decides that it wants to generate power. India has a significant shortage of power, and the best way to get that power is by building a coal plant, right? India is actually planning to build 46 coal plants in the next 5 years. Mind you, India is no laggard in renewable energy. There's a lot of work that they are doing, but the demand for power, the development needs are so vast. And such is the economics that this turns out to be the development optimal solution, right? Getting the power at the least cost happens to be this solution. So it generates power at the cost that the brown cap. We are going to use this plant along with its risks. This plant has, the usual risks of any kind of investment, construction risk, currency risk, political, power production, economic, and so on, right? But here is what the green swap does. The green swap brings in climate investors who are going to provide the greening capex, the additional amount of capital that is needed beyond the brown plant. So from the perspective of the development investor, this project from a cost perspective is going to look just as the coal plant did, except that it won't be a coal plant, it will be a green plant, right? It will generate green power, and the greening capex, that's the incremental financing that's going to come, is going to make it possible for this plant to be green rather than brown. In the process, it will avoid the emissions that a coal plant would have created, and those emissions will be off-taken by a carbon credit off-taker, right? And if we do this correctly, what the green swap does is it doesn't just split up the cost, it also costs and benefits, but it also splits up the risks. So done correctly, the climate investor will not bear any of the regulatory or demand or currency or political risks that generating power involves. They will only have the risks of carbon prices, the green technology, and so on. And if one can do that correctly, one can draw climate investors at a cost of capital that is much lower than what the cost of capital would have been in India had they been saddled with all of these different risks. Right? So the idea here is that brown plant is the development optimal choice for just looking at the development goal. Right? But we are using that as a benchmark to then build the green plant off of that to draw incremental financing as an example. Let's talk about the second example in here. And this is, so when we think about carbon credits, there are, the important thing about carbon credits is that they should be additional, right? Carbon credits are rights, the cost of avoiding, or the most common ones are removal. So if you capture carbon and store that, you remove it from the atmosphere, or you reduce carbon. So for example, if you shut down a coal plant and replace it with a renewable energy plant, that is a reduction-based carbon credit. We believe that, and in this research, we are proposing a third category of carbon credits that we call avoidance, right? Which is that carbon credits that come from preventing an activity, the carbon credits that come from not building a coal plant in the first place, not shutting down one, right? What is the big problem with this? Because it's based upon a hypothetical. How do we know that there would have been a coal plant that this renewable plant is? That is the challenge of additionality. And that's where we believe that what makes this baseline, this counterfactual credible, is the fact that it is the development optimal choice. So if we can establish that development optimality would result in a particular solution, and that the investment from which the carbon credits are being generated is additional to that, and it's changing the outcome, then we have a powerful baseline. And that most of the time today, when we have these discussions, it's financial viability, which is the baseline. And we believe it should actually be development optimality. That should be the baseline. Right? It is also a way of thinking about climate justice. Notice that what is embedded in the green swap is a way of allocating costs. I'm not saying here that the green investor, the climate investor, has to be a charitable investment, or it doesn't have to be a concessional. It can be if the carbon prices, if the offtake is sufficiently attractive from a commercial perspective, it will bring in private financing as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Right? And the credibility of this baseline will be maintained in our proposal by MDBs, multilateral development banks. And notice that those banks have a mandate that has both development and climate needs. Right? And talking about mandates, the third example of this is looking at bilateral aid over the past decade or so. And this is a separate stream of work, and this is going to appear in a journal just in the next few days and in print in next month. But what you're looking at here is bilateral aid in billions of dollars over this 12 years. And what I want you to notice is the gray zone shows you traditional development aid. The total aid has grown quite a bit from even where it was a dozen years ago. But almost all of it has been consumed by this blue zone, which is climate-specific aid, and that red zone, which is crisis-related aid. Right? And this is what we call the triple mandate of aid. We actually started this project thinking about the dual mandate between development and climate, but we then realized, saw this big red piece, and crisis is taking on a big piece. Part of the motivation of this research was also the fact that looking forward with USAID and all the other developments, but most of the major aid ODA providers are shrinking their aid budgets. This is the projection, and how that will result in adjustments across these categories is also something that is of interest. Right? But aid is, again, raises the question of, I should say one other thing about these numbers, and it goes towards this dual mandate issue. The data here is actually not broken up exactly in this way. It is non-humanitarian aid, but some fraction of non-humanitarian aid is tagged as being also addressing climate zones. And what we have done is we've tried to disentangle that a little bit, and that's why we use the term climate-specific aid to the best of our ability to think about those two goals. But notice again that development has remained relatively stagnant as a budget amount. This is all in constant dollars. And when we think about how to navigate this space, how to navigate not only the effectiveness of this aid in terms of the priorities of countries, but also donor priorities, which are also changing over time, we felt like here, again, the global public goods and local goods distinction that I made earlier is a valuable one. We also had to, given that red portion and crisis-related aid, we also felt like long-term and short-term would be something that we would have to think about. And so if you take that data and parse it somewhat more one level deeper, in the humanitarian aid, there is actually two pieces. One is humanitarian aid in developing countries, but then there is also the cost of refugees and taking care of refugees in donor countries. That's a lighter shade. So I've just broken up this into two pieces. And same thing with the climate piece. There is aid that's more oriented towards mitigation and adaptation. And so if we place that on this 2x2, this is what it looks like. But let's go over the categories. Think about humanitarian aid, right? I mean, it's short-term crisis-related aid. It primarily generates local goods, right? But refugees in donor countries, that is also short-term, but it generates global public goods. It's not going into the specific country. It's growing more broadly in a way to handle refugees, right? That's the short-term side. And if you go towards the long-term investment side of aid, climate mitigation, of course, is the one that generates global public goods, and that's a broad category. Adaptation is closer to traditional development, but this is the category, this is the remit of aid of ODA traditionally, right? And so what you can see is there is this expansion of aid across these multiple mandates that have different goals. So once again, we feel like thinking about what is the development optimal solution, and then asking how do other goals, climate or humanitarian for that matter, and should come together, is the notion of development optimal climate finance gives you some kind of a framework to think about that, right? And that's, I think, where I will stop. There are many different applications that you can think about. I've talked about a few of them, and we can discuss others as we go along in the discussion. But let's move on to the next piece of this event, and this is to invite Nick O'Donoghue. Nick O'Donoghue is the CEO, or stepped down as the CEO last year after an 8-year stint at BII, British International Investment. BII is one of the most significant bilateral ODA institutions in the world. It's the UK's institution. It used to be called CDC till about 3 years ago, I think it's right. And Nick brings a rich background. Before that, he was senior advisor on blended finance to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And even before that, from a long career in investment banking, and the last of which was at JP Morgan as global head of research. So join me in welcoming Nick O'Donoghue. So let me start by Nick. Thank you for being here. And I don't know if I mentioned, but Nick is senior fellow at the Musawer Rahmani Center for Business and Government. So he's here today, and he's going to be here for a good part of this year. So really fortunate for him to be here. But let's start by thinking about, from your perspective, early in the private sector, then most recently at BII. I mean, how do you think about the development goals and climate goals, and what do they look like from the perspective of an aid organization?
So, well, thank you, Akash. Thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here, and it's particularly, I should say, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to get the opportunity to be a senior fellow in the MRCGB CBG, because and have the opportunity to spend really most of the next year here in the Kennedy School. So, for those of you who are students here, I look forward to having the opportunity to spend lots of time with you, and we'll be having study groups and so on. So, I'm looking forward to that. So I think I'd start on this question of climate development by talking a little bit about the context and where we're coming from, because historically, and BII CDC is the oldest development finance institution in the world. We started in 1948, so in a sense, we always feel like we sort of invented the field of development finance, particularly in the context of investing in the private sector. And really, for pretty much all the history, all our history, we were what we would define as a development investor. We were interested in trying to provide capital in places where capital was scarce, with a view to helping the private sector grow, so that so that the jobs were created, so that people were paying more taxes, so that governments could create social infrastructure and so on. So that was the basic role. I think where that began to change was really, you go back to 2009 and to the COP at Copenhagen, and that was the first time when I think participants and governments sort of stepped back and really focused on the finance aspect of this. They recognized the need for climate transition, but they also recognized somebody had to pay for it, and where was that money going to come from? And it's surprisingly, before 2009, that really wasn't on a COP agenda. And it was in Copenhagen that we originally agreed the $100 billion a year target by 2020, which was the commitment the developed countries made to developing countries to help them with transition. It was also in Copenhagen where the Green Climate Fund which is a multilateral organization that supports climate finance. It was at Copenhagen where that was set up. So that was where the sort of government's focus and donor government's focus on supporting climate transition really began. And really for the next 5 or 6 years, as is typical, I suppose, in these big projects, not a lot really happened. Everything moved very slowly. I got to BII, or then CDC, in 2017. And when I arrived, we had one person working on climate. We looked at it as sort of a cross-cutting theme. So we tried to, when we were making our investments, we tried to take it into consideration. But really, I mean, we would look at things like if we were funding a business in Pakistan, for example, we might try to persuade them to put a few solar panels on the roof to do some renewable energy. But really, it didn't go much further than that. So that was 2017. Then what happened was, really coming up to Glasgow COP, which is 2020, I guess. That's when, and after the Glasgow COP, that's when really the finance question started getting some real focus and attention. And governments recognizing that they'd made these commitments, which of course by that stage they were a long way. I think the original objective was to meet them in 2020. They were a long way behind on that. So, but that was when governments really decided they needed to get serious about living up to these commitments that they'd made, and it's when so they started sort of looking around to see what vehicle could they use to provide this finance. And they alighted on the development finance sector and the multilateral development banks. And that was a perfectly rational thing to do, because DFIs, we understand, we're investment institutions, number one, and a lot of this climate finance is about investment, and a lot of it's about investment through the private sector. So the DFIs understood investment, they understood the private sector, they knew these countries very well, they had access to some concessionary capital, which often was necessary. So it was very logical that they would go to their DFIs and ask them to do this. And so that's what happened. And so for the last 5 years that I was at BII, we had these almost two targets where we had a target for investment as a whole, and then within that envelope, we had a target for investment in climate finance. And the challenge that that poses is that that it's DFIs are like any other investment institutions. They're full of a crowd of people, lots of really dedicated people, hardworking people who really want to do transactions. They really want to do deals, and that's there's nothing wrong with that. That's where they see their value. And so, of course, if you say to a group of people like that, or any investment institution, they've got to do deals. What are they going to do? They're going to go to the places where the deals are biggest, they're easiest, often the lowest risk. And in the context of a development finance institution, that means they're going to be pushed away from the really difficult countries into somewhat easier countries. So in my context, or our context at BII, always had a big focus on Africa, always had a big focus on sub-Saharan Africa. That's where the climate finance, that's where the development needs are greatest. That's where the greatest gap is in terms of meeting the SDGs. So, but when we got the climate mandate and this requirement to do a 35% climate, immediately you start to think about perhaps we need to do more in India. We broadened our investment. We used to just focus on South Asia, and we broadened it to include Southeast Asia. So you're going to places like Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. These are where deals are bigger, easier, and frankly closer to market. There are also countries which have their own established capital markets or bigger capital markets. So there's clearly you begin to see the signs of a trade-off, and to some extent, given we always operate in a world of limited resources, some cannibalization of the really traditional development finance that we're doing. So in summary, it's not the wrong thing that we have these institutions now doing two things, much better than setting up a completely separate type of institution. But I do think we need to be conscious, and our shareholders, governments, need to be conscious of what impact that is having and what they need to do to make sure that we're really meeting both goals in an optimal way.
And various institutions. So one of the things that we found in some of the research that I was showing towards the end was how aid to the least developed countries has actually gone down, because that's just traditional aid, and it doesn't if there isn't a humanitarian need, then there is and more so towards middle income countries and so on. And the other piece that I've seen just talking to people who do this is that we are going towards the those projects that sort of check both boxes, right? I mean, the development mandate but there are important development priorities that get left aside. Uh, how do you operationalize this in an organization, like from the inside? I mean, this is we sit here and say this is what should happen, but you want to, and I see exactly that it's very logical that the climate mandate got added to the development mandate, because that is where a lot of climate impact is. But how do we make that happen within the organizations?
So I think the easy answer is that we need to more clearly bifurcate why we're doing individual transactions. And that's probably the best example of that is the Norwegians, who have a very, through Norfund, have one of the most, I think, successful and innovative bilateral development finance institutions. They have a completely separate pool of money. It's the same institution. It's actually the same group of people, but it is there's a clear set of development objectives on the development piece. It focuses very directly on lower income countries. And then on the climate piece, it's much more about how can we contribute to scaling up a climate technology and accelerating transition in emerging and developing countries. So much more focused ends up being much more focused on the middle income countries. So that's the basic. So I think that bifurcation is important. We haven't done that in the UK yet. We've ended up We just have a target for climate finance. We have one measurement, which we impact measurement system that we use across all our investments. And certainly, when I retired at the end of last year, we were moving in the direction of being more specific about what the climate targets were. So I mean that bifurcation, of course, is I think helpful, will be helpful. But there's also the question of, okay, but how do you decide how much you're going to put into it? If you have, let's say, two, and I think, by the way, in your research, this introducing this third humanitarian bucket is very helpful. Less relevant in a DFI context because, of course, we don't do
Mm-hmm.
grant making, we don't do humanitarian relief. But in the overall ODA thing, I thought was very significant. And what you see there is the squeeze is coming from both sides. It's coming from climate and the ambition to do more, but it's also coming from humanitarian relief, which is really being driven by refuge, but by the fact that you can pay for refugees in country at least for a year through the ODA budget, and that's been a huge drain from the UK's ODA budget. So you've got this squeeze from both sides, but I think how do you answer the question of, okay, what is the right, how do we decide what we want to put in each bucket, and how do we make, again, assume we work with limited resources, how do we make those trade-offs? And there are things like, I think, the work that you've done in the green swap and trying to disentangle the impacts can be helpful. I know there's a lot of work going on here at Harvard on the social cost of carbon, as an idea about how much is it, what is it, to come up with some sort of cost benefit, more clearer cost benefit analysis of climate finance and benchmark that against what you do on the development side. So but I think we're still a ways away from, I mean, right now, what we need is some very crude, rudimentary sort of like, yeah, this is how much we want. This is how much we want in our climate bucket. This is how much we want in our development bucket.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, and you made this point also, of course, there's a huge amount of overlap. And we know that, particularly when we think about Africa, that first of all, there are 700 million people in Africa that don't have access to reliable power. So you need to, without power, you can't have development. You never get development. So we need to make that power available. A lot of that power will have to come through renewable energy. And so when you can do, as we did in BII, we would do renewable energy projects in Malawi, for example. Of course, that is checking both boxes. It's providing power to people and to businesses, but it's also doing it's also from a climate perspective positive. And then a lot of the adaptation and resilience projects, particularly those around making agriculture more climate resilient and that type of thing. That again is also beneficial. That checks your box on both sides. So there is quite a bit in that overlap.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really, but at the same time, there's also a lot that is being done by development finance institutions and multilateral development banks today. That, as I say, is much more closer to, I think, certainly closer to market. And it begs the question is whether or not really it's the right use of development finance.
Right. Yeah. One of the examples of on the use of ODA for crisis related is Sweden. I think really recently announced that they are going to limit only 8% of their ODA budget for in-donor refugee costs, and so
Yeah.
that it doesn't creep
Yeah.
into development and climate priorities. And another example
Yeah.
from let me in. I'll ask you one more question, and this is sort of, and after that we'll take questions both from the audience and from online. But you've spent a fair amount of time in the private sector before you came at this, worked on blended finance. The green swap is one way of thinking about, disentangling risks and therefore getting cost of capital in a way that would be, and getting carbon credits that would be acceptable to market. But about this, but also more broadly speaking, where do you see the role of private finance in climate, where those climate needs are in places that have significant development priorities and all of those development related risks as well?
So there's been really, I suppose, two big shifts in the world of development finance over the last decade or so. One has been that we talked about. One has been this second or third mandate, or the addition of a specific climate-specific mandate. But the other one has been the rise of the private sector and that started, I suppose, uh, you really you go back to 2016, you go back to the UN Finance for Development conference in Addis, you go back, and out of that came the whole billions to trillions narrative, and a real recognition that we needed to that the private sector had a crucial role to play in development. And then you fast forward to today, or to this year, and what you see is and not just in the United States, where obviously USAID has sort of been eviscerated, but in France, in Germany, in the UK, those four countries, by the way, make up 70% of ODA. Right, all of them have significantly cut their development budget, and that's what you see in that chart that Cash showed, the line going down so steeply this year, and into next year. So when you go to these meetings, as I had the pleasure of doing for a number of years at the World Bank or the COP or whatever, and you listen to the people, certainly sort of this year, there's this belief that the private sector, this gap that's being created by governments pulling back, has to be somehow filled by the private sector. And I think we have, and that's particularly important when we talk about climate, because actually there's a lot that happens through the traditional development budget that doesn't lend itself to the private sector. So support for a lot of the work we do in health, a lot of the work we do in education, it doesn't lend itself, a lot of the capacity building support doesn't lend itself to private. That needs to be supported by grants. But in the climate space, something like 80% of the money that we need to make this transition has to come, or will come, through the private sector. That's because you're dealing, a lot of it is around building renewable, asset-heavy power systems and the transportation systems and so on. So private sector is absolutely crucial, and we need to. I think if we're as Kash said, I joined the Gates Foundation in 2016 to look at blended finance when it was very early, and it's sort of we've made some progress. If you listen to people, you'll hear them talk a lot about blended finance. The numbers on blended finance are that I think we had $18 billion of transactions last year in blend. That's not insignificant, but in the context of a $2 trillion need, it's really, and in the context of we've been trying to do this now for 10 years, it's really not. It's not insignificant. Moves the needle a little bit, but doesn't solve the problem. And so I think this question of how we get more, I think being realistic about what we need to do to get the private sector engaged properly is very important. And I don't think we've really solved that yet. I mean, I don't think we're being necessarily completely honest about what it's going to take. Private sector, you're talking about commercial investors, whether you're talking about companies making strategic investments in places, or whether you're talking about portfolio investors, they need to make money. I mean, they need to earn a commercial risk-adjusted return. I always use the example of when I was in BII, we invested in Africa and we invested in South Asia. And there was only one country in all those countries that in my time as a chief executive didn't have a major macroeconomic or political crisis that led to a major devaluation of their currency. And for most development investors, that makes it really difficult, or investors, wherever makes it very difficult. So until we start creating investment climates that are more conducive to, for profit, to attractive investments, until we start feeling comfortable having our pension funds invested in Nigeria or Kenya or Pakistan, until that happens, I think, and some of that we can help with, but a lot of that also has to come from domestic economic policy and political stability and good governance.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's why one of the part of our research that we are trying to is to figure out what, and that's the idea behind disentanglement. There are some more mitigation-related challenges that probably can draw pension fund investments into Pakistan. Probably flood protection measures cannot draw right, and to be able to make that distinction so that we can and the other piece that we're trying to work on is also thinking about what exactly is needed as an incremental piece to make those climate friendly solutions, right? Because a lot of these funds, they don't want to do development, right? Because development comes with all its risks and so on. And sometimes we've tried to kind of de-risk these projects, but I don't think we have enough capital to de-risk at the scale that we need. So, but keeping those risks within the country, but only bringing on the climate-related risks and rewards with them, and making that a attractive risk-return proposition is something. But there's a lot of work to be done on that, right?
And you mentioned also the carbon credit market. I mean, that's an essential part of that has to be an essential part of funding this climate transition. But at the moment, the market's not really working very well. So we've got a long way to go there.
Yeah, and the irony is that for the most global of problems, we don't have a global market, right? So we have these markets in silos. We have a few minutes to take questions. So we can start with some in the room, and then also take some questions online. And it will probably be a good idea to speak in the microphone so that those who are online can also. And Rachel here has a microphone. Yes, sir, at the back. Please introduce yourself in your question, and ideally, a good question has a question mark at the end.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. My name is Peter Clifford. I work for a group called Adoris, which is creating global carbon markets. And my question is about the green swap. To what extent, or could you give more details into what is being swapped? Is this a financial swap, like an interest rate swap, or is it some other kind of instrument?
The reason we use the term green swap, so at a first level, it is bringing together investment from two sources. But the reason we called it the green swap is because we want to emphasize the fact that risks are being netted out in the way that it is in a financial swap. So you can think of in very sort of nerdy swap language, a swap has a long and a short position. You can think of this as having a long position in the green plant and a short position in the brown plant. When you think of it in a long, short way, you are netting out the development risks, the currency risk, the political risks, the regulatory risks, and so on. And that it's important to notice that netting out, because then what remains is only climate-related risks. And it is only if I'm able to do that effectively, and that's by no means trivial to do, will I be able to draw the capital from pension funds and say, you are investing in a green project in Pakistan, but you are not taking on Pakistani development risks, right? That's the reason why we call it a swap, because we want to emphasize the netting out of risks. So.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being here and telling us about some of the work you were doing. I was wondering about the bit where you were saying that, in an investment firm, people are sort of driven to do deals, and, that has meant this sort of movement towards these sort of middle market economies. Is there any way in which you would want to change the structure or the mandate of BII to actually shift that? Because, I mean, in a traditional for-profit financial institution, you're driven to find the highest return, but here you've sort of got this dual mandate. And I wonder if that's something that you could actually structure into incentives.
By the way, that's Jade Lynn and an MPP too.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and it was something we spent quite a bit of time thinking about. And I'm being, I suppose, a little bit flippant when I say because when you go to organizations like BII or IFC or most of the other development finance institutions, the people are there because they're committed to making a difference on development. They don't want to be in sort of mainstream finance, but at the same time, you sort of have this, they inevitably have this view that they're going to make that difference. They're not going to make that difference if they look at 10 transactions over the course of a year and do none of them. And from a corporate perspective, we are the UK's or they are BII, the UK's development finance institution, and they are not going to be doing their job if they invest nothing in a year, and so you inevitably get these targets of, in BII's case, $2.5 billion a year of new investments that they want to make, and that drives a certain amount of behavior. Now you try to temper that. We spent a lot of time developing this development impact measurement PSI system, of which there's now a case in Harvard Business School. And I think that did make a difference. We set up a separate portfolio with the support of the government, which we call the Catalyst portfolio, where we were very clear that we had the capacity to do smaller transactions, riskier transactions, and more developmental transactions. So you do try to temper that. And I don't want to suggest that this is like they're like some organizations where everybody's getting a percentage of whatever. They're full of very committed people who want to make a difference. But inevitably, in investment institutions, you're going to be looking at volume. Volumes are going to be part of what you do, because if you don't do any volumes, you're not doing your job. So.
I'm going to jump in with a question from our Zoom audience. This is from Muriel Rouyer. She's hoping that you can speak a little bit in more detail about the avoidance credits concept, who calculates it, who implements it, how do you actually ensure that these emissions are actually avoided?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll speak briefly about it, and I said we'll have another event in about 4 to 6 weeks to lay this out much more. But the most important part is the essence of the question: who calculates it, and where do we see this? Because remember, it's avoidance. Avoidance has to be with respect to something that is being avoided, and because it's not happening, it is hypothetical, and that's why our proposal for avoidance-based credits is actually somebody who has the development credentials, who can say, if today, here is the reality. If today Indonesia were to generate the next megawatt of power, there's an 80% chance it would come from a fossil fuel-based plant. That is the development reality, right? And therefore, if I can generate the next megawatt of power in Indonesia using renewable energy, then I am displacing most likely a fossil fuel-based thing. And that additionality can only be established in our view, or can more easily be established in our view by multilateral development banks, because they have that development credential. They can vouch for that counterfactual, and it is that assurance which we will need. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we are talking about tapping global markets, so that that assurance, that credibility, that integrity has to be applicable not just in Indonesia but globally, right? And therefore, multilateral development banks, we believe, are the right institution to be able to do this. Notice also that what we are looking for is not the investment of the MDB. We are looking for the expertise and the credibility of MDBs to be able to do that. And that will be an important part of establishing avoidance-based development optimal. And hence, that development optimality qualification is important in that certification.
Well, one more question here. My name is Jorge Ataco. I'm with BBVA, our European bank, which invests and is very focused on transition investments, on helping the transition. So my question, Professor, and my question to you, Mr. Donoghue, as well, is what would you think will be the most difficult part to implement this green swap idea? Because I'm thinking about the risk allocation, to avoid the finger pointing risk that always happens in project. Who will retain which part of the risk? Maybe the same approach that you just mentioned about who calculates, and maybe we should rely on MDB's experience and credentials. Well, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on this.
I'll say this, but feel free to chime in. From the private sector perspective, the portion that's related to carbon credits is definitely something that MDBs will need to be involved in, or some credible body that does that. And by the way, those ideas can also be incorporated in ICVCM type frameworks, or Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, and so on. this counterfactual, this brown plant that is being used as the benchmark, which will never get built, it will need to be in some ways costed out, right? And then it will need to be frozen in the contractual framework, right? And once that contractual framework is in place, that is what we will use to think about the incremental impact. So we believe that there will be some work that will be needed in, now we are setting up a contract that describes not just the plant, but the plant that would have been, right? And that will be a challenging process, particularly the first few times when we think about that. But wherever we agree on, that will be the benchmark. By the way, the other thing to keep in mind is there are many different places where that, if you call it negotiation in terms of what comes out in the contract, can end up, right? And it may be the case that the global investor, the climate investor, may be willing to take some development risk, that it's not zero. And as long as there is a reward that is associated with that piece of risk, that may be viable for it, right? And in our calibrations of the model, we see that there is enough value on the table to be able to distribute some of that reward, and hence to be able to distribute some of that risk in a way that doesn't need to be a complete, 0 and 1. There is a continuum in there, and there is enough reward to go along with that. Do you want to?
I mean, Akash is obviously the expert on green swap. I mean, from my perspective, there is a lot in the whole price. There's a dependence on carbon, on the price of carbon, the carbon credit market, which is not an efficient market, today. There's so I think that's from a sort of a structuring perspective, that's a big challenge.
Yeah, and carbon markets and the way that we are able to bring credibility into that market. But notice that here we are talking about the credibility of carbon market in a global context, right? In many of these countries, one of the questions that often comes up is, well, shouldn't we develop a carbon market in Indonesia or in India? And of course we should, right? But the fact is that carbon or avoided emissions, it is a global good. And if there are markets in which we are paying $80 a ton, we were able to show in some of the calibration that at $20 a ton, you can justify many of these investments quite easily. So there are countries, again, based upon how they are trading off development and climate and where they see their net zero goals, the value of that carbon as these countries have made the trade-off is different. But if you're trying to solve a global public good problem, we should seek investment and funding from that part of the world, from where the investment costs are lowest and the value of avoided emissions is the highest.
Hi. I'm thinking about the alignment of like climate and development finance, and specifically to address projects that are looking to have outcomes in both of those fields. Capital alignment from different capital sources would be the ideal way potentially to look into those problems, so that different capital sources that are looking for different outcomes can then come together into a single project. And so blended finance seems like an appropriate tool there. So I think what I'm trying to understand is, what's the blocker? Why aren't we seeing more of those projects? Is it because there's no standardized product in the market yet that can then be kind of used across different projects, or is there something else that's missing in the market right now?
So I think, well, first of all, we shouldn't, $18 billion of I think that was actually climate related blended finance last year, is not an insignificant amount, and it shows that things are happening, and it is, we've seen some very significant institutional investors get involved through various forms of blended finance structures. But I think the challenge has been that the transactions, and you touched on when you mentioned the word standardization, most transactions are bespoke transactions. There's very little in the way of standardization. I think there's an unrealistic sometimes what happens in these negotiations, you get, as you say, two different participants. One cares most about the impact. One cares most about sort of ensuring that they have their financial return. They come together. They both sort of share an ambition to have a particular transaction or fund get set up or whatever. I think that sometimes they don't early enough in the process have a discussion about appropriate subsidy, because really that's what blended finance is. In a financial sense, it's the impact investor subsidizing the commercial investor. And so what happens is you sometimes get to the end of the process, and then usually the philanthropic or the impact investor wakes up and says, well, doesn't this mean that we're subsidizing the shareholders of this company, the partners of this firm, or whatever? And the answer is yes, that is what you are doing. And so I think sometimes they're just there's an unwillingness to do that, and people are unrealistic about how difficult it is, and they don't address the hard questions early enough in the negotiations.
We've got one on Zoom from an anonymous attendee who asks, given the current political and economic environment, and particularly in industrial economies, like how do we reignite climate finance momentum?
I think you've been closer to the.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. Obviously, very interesting for me coming over from Europe to the United States. I think, and one of the things I've talked to somebody here before we started, it is clear, you see it more in the States than you do in Europe, that the world's attention has definitely shifted away from climate. How much of that is political and people sort of from a reputational perspective, and how much of that is really based on the fact that we somehow don't believe there's a climate crisis, I'm not sure. But I mean, there's no question that the climate crisis is real. There's no question it's going to get worse. There's no question we have to address it. No question it's going to take vast amounts of capital. So I think this, right now, clearly, particularly here in the US, it's not the flavor of the month, and institutions, including commercial institutions, are almost afraid to position themselves as being sort of climate focused. But I don't think that's a sustainable position over the next 5 or 10 years. And also, I would say in Europe, you see much less of that. It's much less. I think that the view, both publicly and politically in Europe, hasn't shifted that much. Some priorities have shifted around spending, particularly with the need to bolster Europe's defense spending, but the commitment to addressing the climate crisis, I don't think has wavered, not in the way that it has wavered, appears to be wavering here among certain political elements.
I think that we are. Did we take one more question and then at the back there? And we're almost at time.
Who's funding those instruments at the moment, or what? Yeah, well, I don't know whether that's an area you know.
I don't know that.
I'm not really an expert in that. I mean, on the surface, it doesn't sound like the type of thing that development finance institutions and MDBs are going to necessarily be funding. It sounds more like a government I mean, I know that these institutions are owned by government, but it's like in the UK, we have an institution owned by government that's an investment institution, and then we have a government department that funds climate action. And it strikes me that what you're describing is more likely to be coming from government sources rather than the DFIs or MDBs.
Right. I think we will have to keep it at that. Any final words, Nick?
No, just a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us.